What happens when a woman tries to kick Shaquille O'Neal out of his own pool? Victoria thought she was in charge. She saw a man she didn't recognize, assumed he didn't belong, and demanded he leave. When he didn't, she called security, confident they'd take her side. But the moment the guards arrived, everything flipped on its head. Her face turned pale. The crowd gasped because she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. And now, the whole world was about to see it. Hey, real quick, before we get into this wild story, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Where are you watching from? The water was warm, the sun shining just right, and for the first time in weeks, Shaquille O'Neal was finally relaxing. He let his massive frame float effortlessly in the private pool, eyes closed, enjoying the peaceful afternoon. The faint sounds of waves crashing in the distance mixed with soft music from the poolside speakers. Life was good, until it wasn't. A sharp, irritated voice shattered the tranquility. "Excuse me." Shaq's eyes flickered open. He glanced over his shoulder and saw a woman standing at the edge of the pool. She was tall, maybe mid-50s, with perfectly styled blonde hair that hadn't touched water all day. Draped in expensive gold jewelry and wearing a designer swimsuit, she looked every bit the type who didn't like to be inconvenienced. Shaq turned his head slightly, expecting her to be talking to someone else. She wasn't. "What do you think you're doing here?" she snapped, arms crossed tightly against her chest. Shaq blinked, wiping a hand over his face. "Swimming?" His deep voice rumbled, calm but firm. The woman scoffed, taking a step closer. "This is a private pool," she said, enunciating each syllable as if talking to a child. Shaq arched an eyebrow. "Yeah? I know." But she wasn't listening. Other guests lounging by the pool had started to notice the tension. A few lifted their sunglasses, watching with mild curiosity. A waiter carrying a tray of drinks slowed his steps, sensing something was off. Victoria, however, didn't care. "You need to leave," she continued, voice dripping with condescension. "This isn't some public facility where anyone can just walk in." Shaq exhaled slowly. He had encountered this kind of entitlement before, and he already knew where it was headed. He stayed still, treading water, his expression unreadable. "You hear me?" Victoria snapped. "I don't know how you even got in here, but I'm calling security." Shaq let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head. "Yeah, you should do that." That made her pause, her face twisted with confusion. She had expected an argument, maybe even some begging. Instead, she was met with a man who wasn't the least bit concerned. Victoria squared her shoulders, pulling out her phone. "We'll see how funny you think this is when security drags you out," she spat. Shaq didn't respond. He simply swam toward the edge of the pool, placing his hands on the deck and lifting his enormous frame effortlessly out of the water. He stood up to his full height, towering over Victoria. For the first time, she hesitated. The surrounding guests had gone completely silent now. People shifted in their lounge chairs, watching the unfolding scene with wide eyes. Shaq grabbed a towel from a nearby chair, casually drying himself off. "Go ahead," he said, his voice as steady as ever. "Make the call." Victoria's lips curled in disgust as she pressed the phone to her ear. "Hello? Yes, there's a huge trespasser in the pool. Send security, now." Shaq crossed his arms, tilting his head. "Hope they get here quick," he muttered. Victoria's smug expression returned. "Oh, don't worry. They will." In the distance, the faint sound of approaching sirens cut through the air. Shaq smirked. "Good. I was waiting for them anyway." Victoria took a step closer, her designer sandals clicking against the tiled poolside. She tilted her chin up, looking Shaq over as if he were something unpleasant she had just stepped in. "I don't know how you got in here," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "But this is private property." Shaq, still toweling off, arched an eyebrow. He took his time, rubbing his bald head dry before tossing the towel over his shoulder. "Is it?" he asked casually. Victoria scoffed. "Don't act dumb. This resort has standards. Guests only." Around them, a few other poolgoers had started paying attention. A couple in lounge chairs whispered to each other. A waiter carrying a tray of drinks slowed his steps, glancing between Victoria and Shaq. Even the lifeguard perched on his high seat seemed suddenly interested, but Victoria didn't care. Her world had taught her one thing: money and power meant she was always right. "I don't know how you got in here," she continued, flipping her perfectly styled blonde hair. Did someone let you in? Because people like you don't usually... Shaq turned to fully face her, his massive frame blocking the sun. People like me? He echoed. His deep voice was calm, but the edge in it was impossible to ignore. Victoria hesitated, just for a second, but she doubled down. You know what I mean, she said, folding her arms. This is a luxury resort, and I don't remember seeing anyone like you on the guest list. Shaq exhaled slowly. He could already tell exactly where this was going. He'd seen it before, felt it before. I'm calling security, Victoria sneered, reaching into her beach bag for her phone. They'll have you out of here in minutes. Shaq chuckled softly, shaking his head. Yeah, you should do that, he said, crossing his arms over his chest. That threw her off. She expected him to argue, to defend himself, maybe even to get angry. But instead, he was amused. Think it's funny, she snapped. A little, Shaq admitted. Victoria turned away, pressing the phone to her ear. Yes, this is Victoria Harland. I need security at the pool. Now there's a situation. Shaq leaned on a lounge chair, watching her, a smirk playing at the corner of his lips. Hope they get here quick, he murmured. Victoria shot him a glare. Oh, don't worry. They will. As if on cue, the distant wail of sirens cut through the air. A few people at the pool turned their heads. Shaq stretched his arms. Good, he said, his voice even. I was waiting for them anyway. Victoria paced along the poolside, phone pressed to her ear, her manicured fingers gripping it so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Yes, this is Victoria Harlan, she snapped, her voice dripping with frustration. There's a huge trespasser in my pool. I want security here now. On the other end, the resort's security dispatcher hesitated. A trespasser, ma'am? Can you describe... He's massive, she interrupted, and intimidating. He's sitting here like he owns the place. Shaq, still resting his arms on the pool's edge, tilted his head, watching her with mild amusement. Yeah, I'd say that's accurate, he muttered under his breath. Victoria's sharp blue eyes darted back to him. What's so funny? She snapped. Shaq chuckled, shaking his head. Nothing. Nothing. Just enjoying the show. Victoria's face turned red. You think this is a joke? A little, Shaq admitted, shrugging his massive shoulders. But I do appreciate the enthusiasm. A few people around the pool had started watching now. A middle-aged couple in plush lounge chairs exchanged glances, whispering. A waiter with a tray of colorful drinks slowed his pace, unsure if he should intervene. Even the lifeguard sitting high on his perch, who had ignored the initial argument, now seemed very interested. Victoria, oblivious to the attention she was drawing, turned away from Shaq and barked into the phone again. Just get security here now, she ordered before hanging up. Shaq exhaled, wiping water from his face with one massive hand. You really don't want to take a second to think this through, he asked. Victoria scoffed. Think what through? That you don't belong here? Shaq let out a slow whistle. Wow, you just say that stuff out loud, huh? I don't need to explain myself to you, she shot back. This is a private resort. People like you can't just walk in here and act like... People like me? Shaq echoed, raising an eyebrow. For the first time, Victoria hesitated. I mean, strangers, she corrected quickly. But the damage was done. A young couple by the bar exchanged looks. A man near the pool turned on his phone camera. Shaq shook his head and leaned back against the pool wall. All right, he said, his voice calm but firm. Let's wait for security then. Victoria crossed her arms, tapping her foot impatiently. Oh, don't worry, she said, her voice laced with smug satisfaction. They'll have you out of here in minutes. Shaq smirked. Oh, I'm just waiting. For what? She sneered. For security to show up, Shaq said, stretching his arms. Victoria narrowed her eyes, confused by his confidence. But before she could demand an answer, a sound cut through the conversation. The piercing noise echoed through the resort as a black SUV screeched to a halt outside the pool area. A team of uniformed security guards jumped out, moving fast toward the pool entrance. Guests whispered. People pulled out their phones. Victoria smirked triumphantly. See? Game over. Shaq just grinned. Trouble just arrived. But for who? As the heavy footsteps of security echoed closer, one of the guards locked eyes with Shaq. His face immediately changed. Victoria, standing tall, pointed dramatically. "There he is," she declared. "Get him out!" But the guards weren't looking at Shaq. They were looking at her. The wailing sirens cut through the luxurious serenity of the resort. A sleek black security SUV skidded to a stop just beyond the pool area, its tinted windows gleaming under the sun. The doors flew open, and three uniformed security guards stepped out, their boots thudding against the pavement with precision. Victoria's face lit up with satisfaction. Finally, she whirled around, tossing her phone into her designer handbag. "Officers, over here!" she barked, her voice carrying over the quiet murmurs of the crowd gathering near the pool. The guards marched forward, their serious expressions unreadable behind their dark sunglasses. The lead guard, a tall man with a stern jawline and a name badge that read, Rodriguez, stepped ahead of the others. Victoria wasted no time. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger straight at Shaq, still lounging at the pool's edge. "That man is trespassing," she declared, her voice laced with fury. "I want him removed, now!" Rodriguez didn't react the way she expected. He didn't move to restrain Shaq, didn't demand identification, didn't even glance at Victoria. Instead, he walked right past her, straight toward Shaq. "Sir, are you all right?" Rodriguez asked, his voice carrying a note of concern. Shaq, unfazed as ever, cracked a small smirk. "Yeah, I'm good," he said, stretching his arms. "Just trying to enjoy my pool, but seems like I got company." Rodriguez turned back toward Victoria, finally acknowledging her. His face remained neutral, but there was an unmistakable shift in his demeanor, a realization. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. A few guests had their phones recording. Victoria, still standing there in her expensive swimsuit, blinked in confusion. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. "Wait, what?" she stammered, a nervous chuckle escaping her lips. Rodriguez removed his sunglasses, his sharp eyes locking onto her. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "do you know who this is?" Victoria's confidence wavered for the first time. She scoffed. "What does that have to do with anything? He doesn't belong here." Shaq finally stood, all 7 feet, 1 inch of him rising from the pool like a titan. Water dripped from his broad shoulders as he grabbed a towel and casually dried off. The silence was deafening. Rodriguez exchanged a glance with the other guards, who now stood stiff, uneasy. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said, voice firmer now, "Mr. O'Neal owns this property." Victoria's smug expression shattered in an instant. Her mouth fell open, eyes darting wildly between Shaq and the security team. "Wait, what?" she whispered, barely able to process the words. A couple in the crowd gasped. A woman near the bar stifled a laugh. Shaq folded his arms, watching the color drain from Victoria's face. "Yeah," he said smoothly. "I was waiting for security to show up." Victoria's breath came fast, her chest rising and falling as she clenched her fists. The eyes of the crowd burned into her back, but she kept her focus locked on Shaq. He had to be lying. There was no way. She crossed her arms, tilting her chin upward in defiance. "I don't care who he is," she snapped. "He doesn't belong here." Rodriguez, the head security guard, exchanged an unreadable glance with his men before clearing his throat. His voice was steady but carried an undeniable weight. "Ma'am," he said, carefully emphasizing each word, "do you know who this is?" Victoria scoffed. "I don't need to know. I have eyes, don't I? I know he's not supposed to be here." Shaq, still dripping from the pool, took a slow step forward. His presence alone shifted the energy in the air. The crowd hushed as he towered over her, his face calm but unreadable. "You sure about that?" he asked, his voice low and deliberate. For the first time since she opened her mouth, Victoria hesitated. A ripple of murmurs spread through the spectators gathered around the pool. Some people were already recording, their phones tilted just enough to capture the entire scene. "She really doesn't know," someone whispered. "How does she not recognize him?" Another chuckled. Rodriguez exhaled sharply, as if he were dealing with a particularly difficult child. He took a step closer to Victoria and leaned in slightly. "Ma'am," he said, lowering his voice just enough to make it sting, "this is his house." The words hit like a wrecking ball. Victoria blinked rapidly, a nervous chuckle bubbling from her lips. What?" she stammered, shaking her head. "That's not possible." Her fingers curled around the straps of her designer beach bag as if holding onto something expensive would ground her in reality. Rodriguez gestured toward the sleek three-story estate looming in the background, the very one Victoria had been so certain belonged to some exclusive club or elite guest. Mr. O'Neal owns this entire property, he confirmed. You're standing in his pool, on his land. A hush fell over the area. The laughter stopped. The whispers died down. And then, the realization slammed into Victoria all at once. She turned toward Shaq slowly, as if seeing him for the first time. The water glistened on his broad shoulders, the sun reflecting off his smooth, bald head. He stood effortlessly confident, arms folded, eyes watching her now. Not with anger, not with amusement, but with something worse. Victoria's mouth opened and closed, but no. Words came out. The shock registered in waves. Her privileged, self-assured posture crumbled. The heat of humiliation rose up her neck, searing through her skin. The same crowd that had once ignored her entitled rants was now fully engaged, their expressions shifting from curiosity to full-blown enjoyment. That's gotta be the most embarrassing thing I've ever seen, someone muttered. Another man chuckled. She tried to throw Shaq out of his own house. Shaq exhaled a slow breath, shaking his head. I tried to tell you, he said finally, but you were too busy calling security, huh? Victoria forced a laugh, but it was thin, shaky. She glanced around, desperate for an escape route. The confidence she carried moments ago had shattered into tiny, irreparable pieces. The smirk that had danced on her lips? Gone. The power she thought she had? Vanished. She swallowed hard, gripping her designer bag like a lifeline. Wait, what? Victoria's breath hitched in her throat. She took a shaky step back, her manicured fingers trembling as they hovered in the air, still pointing at Shaq. No, this can't be right, she whispered, her voice barely audible. The weight of the moment pressed down on her chest like a crushing force. Everything, her entitlement, her confidence, her assumed superiority, was unraveling before her eyes. Rodriguez, the head security guard, remained firm. He wasn't amused. He wasn't apologetic. He was simply stating the facts. Ma'am, he repeated, his voice even but firm, Mr. O'Neal owns this entire property. That pool you tried to kick him out of, his. The lounge chairs, his. The hotel access, also his. Gasps rippled through the growing crowd of guests and staff who had gathered to witness the drama unfold. Some murmured among themselves, shaking their heads in disbelief. Others were already holding up their phones, recording every second. Shaq let out a slow breath, his massive frame relaxed but commanding. He folded his arms over his chest, his expression unreadable. I tried to tell you, he said simply. His words weren't smug. They weren't even angry. They were just the truth. And that made it so much worse for Victoria. Her world, one where she was untouchable, one where she could bark orders and be obeyed, was crumbling before her. She turned wildly, searching for something, anything to anchor herself back into control. But, she stammered, her gaze darting to the security guards, the hotel staff, the guests who were now very clearly against her. This has to be a mistake, she blurted out, forcing an awkward, breathy laugh, a desperate attempt to claw back control. But the silence that followed was deafening. The smirks, the shaking heads, the whispers, they all knew. There was no mistake. The only mistake had been hers. Rodriguez shifted slightly, lowering his radio, as he regarded her with a mixture of pity and disappointment. You assumed, he said, cutting through her feigned confusion. Victoria's stomach twisted. Assumed what? She snapped, even though she already knew. Rodriguez didn't answer. He didn't have to. The reality was written all over her face. Shaq sighed, stepping out of the pool, water dripping from his massive frame. He towered over her now, his gaze unwavering. Let me guess, he said, his voice calm but laced with meaning. I didn't look like I belonged here, huh? A few gasps sounded from the crowd. Someone murmured, oh, damn. Victoria's lips parted, then closed. She had no defense. For the first time, her privilege wasn't a shield. It was a target. Victoria took another step back, her legs shaking beneath her. The reality of what she'd done was fully sinking in. She wasn't the victim. She was the villain. And the whole world was about to see it. Oh no, she muttered under her breath, horrified. A few feet away, a tourist in sunglasses tapped her phone screen with shaking hands, her mouth slightly open in shock. "Are you getting this?" she whispered to her friend, who stood beside her, also recording. "Oh, you know I am," her friend replied, eyes wide with disbelief. With a quick flick of her fingers, she uploaded the video. Title? Simple. Racist Karen tries to kick Shaq out of his own house. Within seconds, the notifications started flooding in. First a few likes, then dozens, then hundreds. The comment section exploded. Is she serious? Of all people, Shaq? She really thought she could pull this off, LMAO. Shaq is a billionaire, but sure. Let's assume he doesn't belong there. SMH. By the time the video hit Twitter and Instagram, it was unstoppable. Victoria's phone buzzed relentlessly in her designer handbag. The vibration was so intense that she yanked it out with a frustrated huff. The second she unlocked it, her breath caught in her throat. Hundreds, no, thousands of notifications poured in. You've been tagged in a post. Your name is trending. 50+ new comments on your latest Instagram post. Her fingers trembled as she clicked on one of the notifications. Her own face stared back at her from a viral tweet. Mid-sneer, finger pointed aggressively at Shaq. The perfect image of entitled rage. The caption? Imagine trying to tell Shaquille O'Neal he doesn't belong in his own home. The tweet already had 50,000 likes and climbing. No, 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 Victoria whispered. She scrolled down, her panic mounting as she read the comments. We found today's main character. Congrats, Victoria. Oh, she's gonna regret this. Big time. Can someone check if she deleted her accounts yet? Her hands shook so badly she nearly dropped her phone. Inside the hotel's main office, the general manager's phone buzzed nonstop. He glanced down, his stomach tightening as he saw the flood of messages from guests, employees, and, worst of all, corporate. Corporate never called unless it was serious. Sir, a junior manager rushed in, looking panicked. Have you seen Twitter? The general manager swiped open his phone. His eyes widened. Dear God, he muttered. The security guard holding his radio glanced toward the chaos unfolding at the pool. He pressed the button. Yeah, get the hotel manager down here, now. The doors of the hotel lobby burst open, and a sharply dressed man in a navy blue suit stormed out, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. His face was flushed red with frustration, his phone still clutched tightly in one hand. He had been on a damage control call with corporate for the past 10 minutes, and every second had made this situation worse. The moment he stepped into view, he spotted Victoria standing rigidly near the pool, her arms crossed in defiance. Shaquille O'Neal stood beside her, calm but watching. The security team straightened at the sight of their boss. Everyone fell silent. Mr. O'Neal, the manager breathed, running a hand through his neatly combed hair. He forced a tense smile, though sweat glistened on his brow. I am so sorry for this unacceptable misunderstanding. Shaq barely reacted. He tossed a towel over his shoulder, studying the man like he was debating whether or not to accept the apology. You know, Shaq said casually, I'm not the one you should be apologizing to. The manager blinked. What? Shaq nodded toward the crowd, where a group of guests and hotel staff had gathered, many still recording. Them, Shaq said, his voice calm but firm. Your staff, your guests, everyone who just watched this go down, because I ain't the only one who saw it. The manager's face paled slightly. Victoria, meanwhile, let out a sharp scoff, rolling her eyes. Oh, for God's sake! Shaq cut her off with a single glance. Lady, he said, his deep voice quiet but commanding. I'm talking. Victoria's mouth snapped shut. The tension in the air was thick. Guests whispered amongst themselves. A man near the bar muttered, She's about to get what's coming. The manager inhaled deeply, trying to regain control of the situation. Victoria, he said finally, turning toward her. We need to have a talk. Victoria stiffened, her perfectly manicured fingers digging into her designer handbag. What does that mean? She demanded. The manager's jaw clenched. It means, he said slowly, that your behavior today has violated our hotel's policies. This is a 5-star establishment. We do not tolerate harassment of any kind. She gawked at him. Harassment? I was just protecting the guests. The manager's voice hardened. From the owner of the estate? Gasps rippled through the crowd. Victoria's entire body tensed. She was out of excuses and out of power. Her phone buzzed again, another flood of messages hitting her notifications. The internet had already decided her fate. The inevitable consequences. The manager crossed his arms, his face stern. "You've been a valued guest here, Victoria." "But," he sighed, shaking his head, "not anymore." Victoria's eyes widened in horror. "You, you can't mean that," she whispered. The manager adjusted his tie. "You're banned from this property, effective immediately." Victoria sat stiffly in the luxurious hotel lounge, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. The room, usually a place of comfort, now felt like a courtroom, with every eye in the lobby discreetly watching her downfall. Her heart pounded with anger, but her face was carefully composed. Years of privilege had trained her to mask panic with indignation. Across from her, the hotel manager sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. The tension in the room was thick, the weight of the situation finally settling on Victoria's shoulders. "I'm a loyal customer," she snapped, trying to regain control. "I have spent more money here than half of the people staying in this hotel. I deserve better treatment than this." The manager's jaw tightened. "Not anymore," he said firmly. Victoria jerked back, as if slapped. "What do you mean?" she demanded. The manager leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his expression grim but resolute. "It means," he said, "that as of this moment, you are banned from this property indefinitely." Victoria froze, her entire body going rigid. "You can't do that," she said, her voice a dangerous whisper. The manager's brows lifted slightly. "Actually, I can." A security guard stepped forward, a badge gleaming on his chest. "And we will enforce it." Her head snapped around, her gaze jumping between the manager and the guard. Her face flushed, but she quickly tried to compose herself. "I was just looking out for the guests," she hissed. "I had no idea who he was." "And that," the manager said, his voice steady, "is the problem, Victoria. You assumed, you judged, and you caused a scene that embarrassed this hotel and insulted one of our most respected homeowners." She shook her head quickly, trying to fight back. "But no." The manager's voice cut through her excuses. A murmur spread through the lounge. Guests had gathered just outside the velvet ropes, some whispering, others filming. A wealthy couple in an expensive resort where eyed Victoria with disapproval, shaking their heads. A group of young tourists snickered, one of them whispering, "This is unreal." For the first time in a long time, Victoria felt something foreign creeping into her chest. Humiliation. She had no power here, no authority, no control. Her perfect world was collapsing right in front of her, and she had no one to blame but herself. The manager stood. "Security will escort you to your suite to collect your belongings," he said. "You'll have 1 hour before you need to leave the premises." Victoria clenched her fists, her breath coming in short bursts. "This isn't over," she spat. The manager only shook his head. "For you, it already is." The final blow, Victoria's phone vibrated violently in her purse. She snatched it up, her stomach sinking at the flood of notifications. Her name was trending, and not in the way she wanted. Shaq stood tall, arms crossed, watching Victoria unravel before him. Her once confident posture had collapsed into desperation. "Please," she pleaded, her voice thinner now, missing the sharp arrogance it once held. "I didn't know." Shaq let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "That's the problem," he said, his deep voice cutting through the tension. "You assumed." Victoria's mouth opened, but no words came out. "You saw a black man in your space," Shaq continued, "and your first reaction wasn't to ask, wasn't to think, it was to demand, to control." Her face turned crimson. The guests watching from the sidelines whispered among themselves. Some had their phones up, still recording. Victoria knew. Her humiliation wasn't over. It was just beginning. I didn't mean," she tried again, voice wavering. Shaq raised an eyebrow. "Didn't mean what?" he asked. She swallowed hard. "Didn't mean to assume I was trespassing?" he pressed. "Didn't mean to treat me like I didn't belong?" Victoria bit her lip. Shaq shook his head. "Lady, the problem ain't that you didn't know. The problem is that you didn't care to know." Her shoulders slumped. "You saw what you wanted to see. And now, the world is seeing you for what you really are. Victoria's breath hitched. She had spent years crafting her image, polished, privileged, untouchable. Now, one mistake, one moment of arrogance, and it was all crumbling. Shaq exhaled and turned to the hotel manager. "You should be grateful," he said, nodding toward Victoria. She blinked. "What?" "For one thing." She leaned forward, desperate for something, anything, to redeem herself. "For the fact," Shaq said, his tone firm, "that I'm the one you tried to mess with, and not someone else." The implication hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. He could have pressed charges, could have dragged her through a lawsuit, but he didn't, because this was the real punishment. Her reputation was already ruined. She had done that all by herself. The final blow. Shaq turned to security. "Escort her out." Victoria staggered back, her world tilting as two guards stepped forward. Her lips parted, a final attempt to protest, to beg, but no sound came out. She had lost. And as the guards led her away, the whispers grew louder. She wasn't just leaving the hotel. She was leaving behind the life she once controlled. A social media firestorm is brewing after an entitled woman tried to kick NBA legend Shaquille O'Neal out of his own pool. The news anchor smirked as she played the viral footage on the screen behind her. It had already been shared millions of times. Comments flooded in under hashtags like #poolside privilege, #Shaq wins again, and #instant karma. The video showed Victoria's initial arrogance, her meltdown, and finally her humiliating walk of shame as security escorted her out. The internet did not hold back. The world weighs. In how do you try to kick Shaq out of Shaq's house? One tweet read, racking up 500,000 likes. A TikTok user laughed. "That lady didn't just fumble the bag, she set it on fire." Even celebrities chimed in. Former NBA players, actors, and comedians roasted Victoria. Kevin Hart posted, "Shaq, you ain't just a legend on the court. Dude is dunking on racists too." Victoria, meanwhile, she vanished, Victoria's social media purge. By morning, her Instagram was gone. Her Twitter, disabled. Her Facebook, wiped clean. But the internet never forgets. People dug into her past, unearthing more moments of entitlement. Videos of her belittling servers, cutting lines at exclusive parties, and throwing tantrums over lesser people. The backlash was relentless. Meanwhile, Shaq kept it short and simple. He posted a photo of himself back in the pool, sunglasses on, grinning. The caption, "Moral of the story? Don't assume, just ask." It became one of his most liked posts ever. Cliffhanger, the unexpected twist. But just as the internet thought it was over, something wild appeared in the comments. A verified user posted, "She's suing." Shaq paused mid-scroll, raising an eyebrow. Victoria was coming back for revenge. Now this just got interesting. Shaq leaned back in his oversized chair, chuckling as he scrolled through his phone. The internet was still buzzing about Victoria's epic downfall, but now there was a new twist. Victoria Simmons files a lawsuit against Shaquille O'Neal for emotional distress and public humiliation. Shaq read the headline out loud, shaking his head. "Man, you can't make this up." His phone buzzed, his lawyer calling. "Shaq!" The voice on the other end sighed. "You see this nonsense?" Shaq grinned. "Oh, I saw it. And I gotta say, I'm not even mad. I'm entertained." "Well, don't be," the lawyer replied. "It's ridiculous, but she's actually trying to take you to court." Shaq leaned forward, rubbing his temples. "For what? Her own stupidity? She claims you damaged her reputation by allowing the video to go viral." Shaq laughed so hard his stomach hurt. "I didn't allow anything. The internet did that all by itself." His lawyer sighed again. "Doesn't matter. She's desperate, Shaq. But don't worry. No lawyer with half a brain will take her case." Shaq smirked. "Let her try." The world responds. Again. By the next morning, the lawsuit news had gone viral. Memes flooded Twitter and TikTok. One showed Victoria in a clown wig, with the caption, "Imagine trying to sue Shaq for kicking you out of his house." Even legal experts chimed in. "This lawsuit is DOA," one attorney said on a talk show. Victoria has no case. She was in the wrong from the start. Victoria, meanwhile, doubled down. A video surfaced of her ranting to a news reporter. "This is about principle. I was set up," she whined, clutching a designer bag. The reporter raised an eyebrow. "Set up how exactly?" Victoria stammered. They made me look like a racist." The internet exploded in laughter. "You made yourself look like a racist," someone commented under the video. Victoria's plan was backfiring. Badly. No lawyer will touch it. A week passed. Shaq's lawyer called again. "Guess what?" he said, amusement in his voice. Shaq grinned. "Let me guess. No lawyer wants to take her case?" "Not a single one." Turns out even the greediest attorneys knew this was a lost cause. Victoria tried law firm after law firm, but the answer was always the same. "Miss Simmons, we don't see a viable case here." Translation? She had no leg to stand on. Eventually, Victoria dropped the lawsuit in complete humiliation. Meanwhile, the hotel management had been watching everything unfold, and they weren't going to let something like this happen again. They announced a new anti-discrimination policy stating, "We do not tolerate racial profiling or harassment of any guest or property owner. Any behavior resembling this incident will result in a permanent ban." It was a direct shot at Victoria. And Shaq, he was more than happy about it. Shaq's final move one evening, Shaq sat by his pool, undisturbed this time, scrolling through his phone. He posted a simple 3-word tweet. "Some lessons hurt." It racked up millions of likes within hours. But the best part? The comments. "Victoria learned today." Instant karma at its finest. "Bro just wanted to swim in peace." Shaq chuckled, shaking his head. "Some lessons are expensive," he muttered, stretching his legs. This one? This one was free." And with that, he leaned back and enjoyed his peaceful swim. This time, without interruptions.